In the winter of 1944, a senior officer of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend named Sturmbannführer Arnold Juttner sat in a field command post outside the Belgian village of Dom Bütgenbach and wrote an assessment of what his unit had just encountered. He had commanded armored infantry on the Eastern Front. He had overseen operations in Normandy where entire Allied regiments had bent and fractured under sustained German pressure. He had, by any reasonable measure, seen the full range of what American infantry was capable of, and yet the report he filed on the night of December 21, 1944, contained a sentence that his superiors found difficult to process. He wrote, "We attacked a company. We should have destroyed a company. What we found instead was something that behaved as though destruction was not a category that applied to it." He was not writing metaphor. He was writing after-action analysis. The distinction matters enormously. This is not a story about a division. It is not a story about a corps or an army or a theater of operations. It is the story of approximately 170 American soldiers belonging to Company B, 1st Battalion, 26th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, who occupied a defensive position on a frozen Belgian hillside and refused, over the course of 4 days and 5 major assaults, to give it up. The Germans who attacked them had tanks, they had artillery, they had numerical superiority at every point of contact. They had the momentum of an offensive that had already shattered multiple American units across a 130-kilometer front. What they did not have, and what they would not be able to account for in any of their after-action reports, was a framework for understanding what Company B was going to do to them. To understand Dom Bütgenbach, you need to understand the larger operational picture in December 1944. Operation Wacht am Rhein, Hitler's grand counteroffensive through the Ardennes, was designed around a single principle: speed. The Germans needed to move faster than the Allies could respond. They needed to punch through the front, seize road networks, and reach the Meuse River before Allied commanders could redirect forces. The road junction at Dom Bütgenbach and the adjacent ridge system at Elsenborn sat directly astride one of the primary northern routes the Germans intended to use. If the 12th SS Panzer could take that ground, they could widen the corridor, pour additional divisions through, and threaten the entire northern shoulder of the Allied line. A single American infantry company was sitting on that road. The Germans needed it moved. They calculated it would take, at most, a determined assault. Company B was commanded by Captain Kimball Richmond, a 28-year-old from Worcester, Massachusetts, who had been with the 1st Infantry Division since North Africa. Richmond was not a flamboyant officer. He was the kind of officer whose men described him, when they described him at all, in functional terms. He knew the ground. He knew his soldiers. He understood defensive positions the way a carpenter understands joints, not as abstractions but as structural realities where every angle and every gap has consequences. When Richmond established his perimeter on the frozen ground above Dom Bütgenbach, he was not thinking about heroism. He was thinking about fields of fire, about interlocking positions, about which approaches would channel German armor and which would leave his flanks exposed. Was thinking about what happens when the first tank comes, and what happens when the 5th tank comes, and what he needed his men to still be doing when the 5th tank came. The men of Company B came from everywhere. Private Joseph Kaminski was 19 years old from a Polish neighborhood in Chicago. Staff Sergeant Delmar Albright had been a high school football coach in rural Indiana before the war. Private First Class Thomas Reardon had worked on the docks in Baltimore and had enlisted 2 days after Pearl Harbor. These were not professional soldiers in the European sense. They had not been raised from childhood in a military culture that valorized sacrifice as an abstract ideal. They were Americans, which meant they were practical, which meant they were skeptical, which meant that when they decided to hold a frozen hillside against the SS, they had made that decision in the same matter-of-fact way they might have decided to fix a broken engine or finish a Harv's tea before the rain came. Because it needed doing. Because they were the ones there to do it. The first assault came at approximately 0430 on the morning of December 20th. The 12th SS Panzer had spent the night maneuvering 2 Panzer IV battalions and a full regiment of Panzergrenadiers into assault positions. The Germans had artillery preparation. They had half-tracks. They had the darkness and the fog that had grounded Allied air support for days. By every conventional military calculation, a reinforced company in a prepared but lightly armed defensive position should have held for perhaps an hour. should have inflicted meaningful casualties on the attacking force, and then should have broken. That is what infantry does. That is the arithmetic that military planners use when they plan. The 12th SS Panzer had done this arithmetic. They were wrong. Richmond had registered artillery targets before the assault began. This is a technical detail, but it is not a small one. It means he had coordinates pre-plotted to specific terrain features and road approaches, so that when German armor appeared at those features, his forward observers could call fire immediately without the delay of calculating new coordinates under fire. When the 1st Panzer column emerged from the tree line to the northeast at 0440, Richmond's observers had rounds downrange in under 90 seconds. The lead tank was hit and blocked the approach road. The infantry behind it began to disperse, and the assault stalled 40 minutes after it began. This was not luck. Richmond had planned for this exact sequence. He had thought harder about that road approach in the preceding 12 hours than the German planners had thought about it in the preceding 12 days. Hauptmann Werner Schaefer commanded the lead Panzergrenadier battalion in that first assault. He survived. He filed a report. The report is remarkable for its controlled confusion. He wrote that his unit had engaged what appeared to be a standard rifle company in prepared positions, and that the American defensive response had been, in his words, disproportionately precise. He meant that the Americans were not simply defending. They were defending according to a plan that had anticipated the specific form of his attack. He found this unsettling. He was not wrong to find it unsettling. It meant that somewhere on that frozen hillside, an American officer had looked at the same terrain he had looked at and had read it more accurately. The second assault came that afternoon. The Germans shifted their axis of attack, coming from the southeast this time, using a draw that offered some cover from direct observation. They sent infantry ahead of the armor, probing for the gaps in Richmond's line. There were no gaps. Richmond had positioned his squads to cover exactly that draw, anticipating the shift. The infantry assault was met with automatic weapons fire from 2 interlocking positions that had been invisible to the German reconnaissance. 3 squads of Panzergrenadiers were cut apart in under 6 minutes. The tanks following them pulled back. The draw became a place where German soldiers lay in the snow and could not be extracted until nightfall. I want to be precise about what was happening to the Germans psychologically during these failed assaults, because the tactical record alone does not fully capture it. The 12th SS Panzer Division was composed of young men who had been, in many cases, members of the Hitler Youth before they were soldiers. They had been raised inside an ideological system that told them, with total consistency, that they were superior, that they were the inheritors of a martial tradition without peer, that the American soldier was an amateur, a product of a mongrel culture without the discipline or the will to fight a real war. Every failed assault on Company B's position was not just a tactical setback. It was a data point that contradicted everything they had been told about themselves and about the enemy. That is a particular kind of damage. It does not show up in casualty reports. Obersturmführer Klaus-Heinrich Müller, a platoon leader in the 3rd Panzergrenadier Battalion, participated in 3 of the 5 assaults on Company B's position. He survived the war. In 1962, he gave an interview to a West German military history journal in which he described what it felt like to attack that hill for the 3rd time. He said, "By the 3rd day, we were no longer attacking an American position. We were attacking an idea. The position was almost secondary. What we were trying to do was prove that the men on that hill could be moved, and they would not be moved. That is not the language of a man describing a purely physical struggle. That is the language of a man who understood that something philosophical had happened on that hillside, something that had recalibrated what he believed about war and about the men who fight it." The ammunition situation inside Company B's perimeter by the morning of December 21st was severe. Richmond had calculated his resupply requirements based on holding for 48 hours before relief or resupply could reach him. He was now past that window with no certainty of when either would come. His men were rationing rifle ammunition. The heavy machine guns were down to their last belt boxes. Medical supplies for the wounded were nearly exhausted. Private First Class Reardon, the Baltimore dock worker, had been shot through the shoulder on the 2nd day and had refused evacuation on the grounds that there was nowhere to evacuate to, and he could still operate a Bayar with his good arm. This was not presented as heroism. It was presented as a logistical assessment. He was right on both counts. Richmond sent a radio message to battalion headquarters on the morning of December 21st. The message has survived. It read, in its entirety, "We are still here. Send ammunition. Send it fast." There was no request for reinforcement. There was no report of imminent collapse. There was a statement of current status and a specific logistical request. I find this message more revealing about the character of Company B than almost anything else in the documentary record. Richmond was not frightened. He was not asking for rescue. He was managing a supply problem. That is the mental state of a man who has not yet entertained the idea that the position might be lost. The Germans massed 5 Panzer IVs and 2 companies of infantry and came directly at the center of the American line under the cover of a 10-minute artillery barrage. One of Richmond's machine gun positions was destroyed in the barrage. A section of the perimeter briefly collapsed inward. For approximately 20 minutes, there was a penetration. Sergeant Albright, the former football coach from Indiana, took 4 men and counterattacked into the penetration with grenades and rifle fire, closing it before the Germans could exploit it. He was hit twice during that action. He kept moving. The penetration closed. The German infantry following the tanks found themselves inside a perimeter that had sealed behind them. They were surrounded by the men they had been attacking. Most of them did not survive the next hour. The German commanders studying the assault pattern by the morning of December 22nd were beginning to make a calculation that no German officer makes easily. They were beginning to calculate whether the objective was worth the cost. Juttner's report, written that morning, noted that 3 assaults against a single company had consumed resources equivalent to what the division had planned to expend, taking the entire Elsenborn Ridge sector. He was not wrong about the mathematics. What he was struggling to articulate was the reason. The reason was not American material superiority. Company B had less of everything than the units attacking it. The reason was something Juttner would eventually call, in a later analysis written after the war, der unbewegte Kern, the unmoved center, a quality he attributed to the American defensive doctrine but which was, in reality, not a doctrine at all. It was a decision made individually by every man in that perimeter. The 4th assault came on December 22nd, a full armored thrust with 6 tanks and nearly 300 infantry. It was the most powerful single attack the Germans had yet mounted against Company B's position. Richmond had received a partial resupply by then, ammunition carried forward by hand under fire by soldiers from Battalion Headquarters Company who had volunteered for the run. The resupply gave him enough to fight another 8 hours at full engagement rate. He used those 8 hours. The assault lasted 4.5 hours. The Germans took significant ground on the left flank before being stopped. Richmond ordered a withdrawal to a tighter inner perimeter and simply reoriented his defense. The ground the Germans had taken was 40 meters of frozen Belgian hillside that served no purpose once the Americans were no longer standing on it. Schaefer, who had led the first assault and had survived to lead this one too, wrote to his wife that evening from a dressing station where he was having a minor wound treated. The letter was captured after the war and translated by American military historians. He wrote, "I don't know how to tell you what we are fighting here. I have attacked British positions. I have attacked Soviet positions. I have attacked American positions before this week. None of them were like this. These men have decided something that I cannot find a name for. They have decided in advance that this hill is the last place they will ever give up, and so it is." What makes that letter extraordinary is its precision. Schaefer was not describing American valor as though it were a natural quality, something these men had been born with like height or eye color. He was describing a decision, a prior decision made before the battle began. He was right. That is exactly what it was. General William Roosevelt, the regimental commander, visited what remained of Company B's position after the battle, and wrote in his own report that what he found was not the aftermath of heroic resistance. What he found was the aftermath of a decision made collectively by a group of men that they were not going to be the company that let those tanks through. The 5th and final major assault came on the morning of December 23rd. The Germans had committed their reserves. They had shifted artillery. They had rested their infantry and reorganized their tank sections. They came with everything they had left to give. Richmond had 47 effective fighting men remaining in his perimeter. He had ammunition for, by his own estimate, approximately 2 hours of sustained contact. He had no evacuation plan because there was no route to evacuate on. He had wounded men lying in shallow scrapes in the frozen ground who would not survive transport. He placed his 47 men and he waited. The assault broke. Not immediately. not without further American casualties, but it broke. The Germans reached the wire in 2 places and were thrown back both times. At approximately 10:30, the 12th SS Panzer's assault elements began withdrawing from the forward positions they had spent 4 days trying to take. There was no dramatic moment. There was no single act that turned the battle. The Germans simply ran out of the capacity to keep absorbing what Company B was doing to them. And Company B was still there, still shooting, still occupying the same position it had occupied on December 20th. I said earlier that Juttner's analysis used the phrase, der unbewegte Kern. But the document goes further than that phrase. In the final paragraph of his post-war assessment, Juttner wrote that the failure at Dom Bütgenbach had taught him something he had not expected to learn from Americans. He wrote that the Americans had demonstrated what he called a privater Gehorsam, a private obedience, an obedience not to orders or to commanders or to ideology, but to themselves, to some internal standard they had set before the battle began. He wrote that this quality was, in his professional judgment, more dangerous than any weapon. He was not wrong. A weapon can be destroyed or captured or used up. A decision that has already been made cannot be taken away. Company B at Dom Bütgenbach made that decision, and the 12th SS Panzer Division spent 5 assaults and 4 days, and hundreds of casualties, discovering that there was no force they could bring against it that would change what had already been.